Welcome to A Tippling Philosopher again. This is 2 days in a row I've done a live interview, and 2 days in a row I'm really excited and privileged to be joined by a superb guest. We've just overcome technological challenges to bring you the wonderful David Fitzgerald, and this is yet another time where I've known someone in different social media landscapes before actually ever speaking to them for the live. And this is the first time I've spoken to David live. And he's been so good in the past to have written a foreword for 2 of my books, right? And yet this is the first time we have spoken in person. So David, thank you so much. We'll get onto them later. Thank you so much for agreeing to this. How are you?
I'm good. I'm glad we got over these technical little hitches. I'm hoping you're hearing me better than I'm hearing you. It's very, very quiet, but I'm afraid to touch my phone in case I hit the wrong thing and disappear again.
You sound absolutely perfect to me, and hopefully people let us know in the comments if anything is too faint. But as far as I'm concerned, things are good. You
Awesome.
might just have to clear out your ears a bit,
which is my usual modus operandi anyway. But as you say, it's wonderful to actually be able to hear you and see you in live time, because we've known each other for a long time. We've worked together on a lot of time, and this is literally the first time we're talking.
Yeah, it's wonderful, brilliant. And you know, that modern technology, isn't it great for bringing minds and ideas together and helping to disseminate ideas to the wider world. And I think it's a good time to live.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna risk one more button, just see if I can get my volume to come up just a smidge. Say something now, Jono.
Yep. Good.
It's a little better. Yeah, it's a little better.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I'm sorry that I'm so faint, because there's nothing like listening to me loud. Introduce yourself, because most people are going to know exactly who you are, but actually there will be some people who watch this video later or whenever who might not know who you are.
Sure.
And it's interesting, just before you do that, we have interesting similarities. So although I'm a historicist in terms of whether Jesus existed, I think the difference between my position and your position is so minimal that actually, and we'll talk a lot about this later. But
yeah, I hope we do, because that's an important thing. Is people treat most mythicists like we're these pariahs out in Crazyville, far outside the camp. And really, the peer-reviewed mythicists that I follow, they're right on track with everything. 99% of what other historians are saying.
Definitely.
And it's just a matter of emphasis.
That's going to be a large part of what we talk about.
Sure.
But there's similarities between you and I. We both write books on biblical exegesis, basically, and we both write fiction books as well. And it'll be interesting to have a little chat to you at some point later about that. But introduce yourself.
Sure. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm David Fitzgerald, and in that I'm known at all, it's mostly for my nonfiction books on what I like to call biblical history for atheists. And most of them so far have involved either taking on groups like the Mormons or more famously making the argument that Jesus never existed at all. And I really don't mean that as any kind of hyperbole or anything, I really mean that, no, I don't think the guy existed at all. And having said that, it's not that I think, people are stupid for thinking there was a Jesus. There's nothing implausible about there being a Jesus. I certainly spent the first 16 years of my atheist life assuming there was a Jesus. I mean, why wouldn't you? It never crossed my mind that there wouldn't have been. And ironically, what got me in this whole mythicist business is when I became curious to know, well, when you read the 4 Gospels, you're getting 4 very different Jesuses. And when I started realizing that, it started making me wonder, well, I wonder which one is giving us the real Jesus and which is just legendary accretion that came later. And as they say, this is where my troubles began, because I started looking into just idly seeing how we could parse out the real Jesus, the historical Jesus, from the mythicist Jesus of faith, mythical Jesus of faith, rather. And once you start doing that, as I say in my book, Nailed, once you start pulling on that thread, pretty soon you don't have a sweater anymore. And for all the atheists I know out there who poo-poo the idea that there was no Jesus, one thing I want to make really clear is when you actually look at the evidence for Jesus and all the arguments back and forth between the historicists who think there was at least a guy named Jesus and the mythicists who think, no, it's myths all the way down, everything we learn in that back and forth helps us better debunk what's not true about Jesus. It better gives us a reason to counter anybody who says they know how Jesus wants us to think or act or vote. And that alone is a good thing.
Yeah. So interesting you said in the first 16 years of my atheist life. So before we get into a bit of historicism and mythicism, can you talk us through your life as a Christian? Were you ever a Christian? What was your deconversion experience? Explain to us how you came by your atheism.
Yeah, it's very funny actually, because I was raised Southern Baptist, super Christian all through, growing up, all through school, all the way up into college. And in college, I started having debates. The way I would flirt with this girl is that we'd have theological arguments with each other. And she would always give me the hippy dippy answer for this or that. And I'd always give the staunch, true Southern Baptist response to this. And one day we were going at it and she says, well, Dave, the Hindu religion is like 3,000 years older than Christianity. And I was all set to jump down her case and go, no, it's not. And before I could get a word out of my mouth, I realized I was about to say, no, it's not. And I had no idea whether Hinduism was older than Christianity or not. And that thought that I was just about to say something I didn't know was true or not with passion and with vigor and conviction made me think, oh my God, I'm just like the Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. If you're old enough to remember David Byrne and the Talking Heads, it was like, my God, what have I done?
It's really interesting you say that, and interesting idea about threads. But I remember when I was at university, I read something in a newspaper, just a random article in a short article in the newspaper, and I went and told my friend about this story, and my friend just disagreed with some of the claims in it, and we got into this massive heated argument. And I remember reflecting back on this a day later, thinking I got into an argument about something that I didn't really care about whatsoever, right? And I was only defending it on account of that I read it in a newspaper, and it was in a newspaper I didn't really care for anyway. So, what I'd done is that I'd taken on this idea, and it became part of me and my identity because I was informing someone else of this. They disagreed with it, and that put my heckles up, and this became a big argument, but an argument that I had no horse in that race.
Isn't that funny?
Other than I was delivering something that I thought was true.
Yeah. And it's interesting you say that, because I get the feeling that that's where a lot of atheist resistance to mythicist theory comes from, is they've already lumped it with Holocaust denial and moon landing denial and creationism, and I've heard people explicitly say, oh, this is creationism for atheists, and nothing could be further from the truth. Absolutely nothing.
So was that first thread that started unraveling your belief? How quick was your deconversion?
It was first, first the awareness that all the four gospels were presenting very different not just teachings, but very different personalities. And they weren't even saying that the same things happen, the same events happen. The difference between learning that there were differences between the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the Johannine gospel, John, and then actually seeing what those differences are kind of blew my mind. But I remember even as a Christian asking my pastor something to the effect of, about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and him just casually off the cuff saying, no, those probably weren't the guys who wrote it. And, that came to roost later for me when I was looking into the whole historicist thing. And again, not to debunk Jesus, I was just trying to find the real Jesus that we could, because when I read things like his final words on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? I really felt bad for Jesus when I saw, him in the Garden of Gethsemane, and realize how scared this character was, I really felt bad for that real Jesus. And then you discover that this, like so much of the Gospel of Mark, is taken from the Hebrew scriptures. And that's really actually the opening of Psalm 21. And you can do that game for everything in Mark's Gospel from start to finish. And,
it's not, and it's not just that, because I mean, it is that's hugely important, but it's also the idea that the synoptics present a Jesus, I would argue, who is not divine, as in not a god, but is a divine human. So he's a Messiah.
Especially in Mark, where he makes mistakes. He tries to do the same healing things that other pagans do, and sometimes he has to try twice because he messes up when he does it.
Yeah. And the idea that you talk there about why hast thou forsaken me? What makes no sense of a holy trinity. It makes no sense of which is what John would be portraying. So this is that conversation you were having with yourself about how there are 4 different Jesuses, or you could argue there is 3 Jesuses that are fairly similar in the synoptics, and one Jesus is totally different ontologically.
And the interesting thing about even those 3 is that the differences we see in them are deliberate. It's like, oh no, they decided to. Well, Matthew likes correcting Mark's mistakes about basic Judaism, which is interesting. Luke just repeats his mistakes, but they all go off. They're either in lockstep with each other, or they're going off in completely incompatible, contradictory directions for theological reasons.
Yeah. Absolutely. So you became an atheist. Was that what age were you when you became an atheist? Were you were you committed? How did that happen?
I was totally committed. But the day of that argument, it's like 1 millisecond. I know for people like Dan Barker and John Loftus and David Madison, who went through these long, drawn out, their face just goes and dies by 1,000 paper cuts. I can remember the millisecond I was a committed, believing Christian, and the next second where it's like, what have I done? This obviously feels fake. It was, it was so bizarre what a break that was. And
so given that, and then let's assume you had 16 years, well, not assume, you just said you had 16 years of historicist atheism.
Yes.
What was the moment? What was the trigger that led you down the path towards mythicism?
Now that was more of a long drag for me, because like I said, I went into it just assuming, never even assumed there wouldn't be a Jesus. I just figured we could dig through and separate the chaff from the wheat. And then started getting red flags, like realizing that these are not written by eyewitnesses. They don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and they don't read like they're written by eyewitnesses. And they are completely incompatible with each other. So somebody in these isn't telling the truth, and maybe not all of them. It wasn't very long after that process where I started coming across other scholars who were saying this. And Earl Doherty was my first big window on mythicism. It's like, what, there's scholars out there who actually think he didn't exist at all, and that kind of blew my mind. But it's one of those things that at first I thought was ridiculous, and then I looked into it, and suddenly it starts making a lot more sense.
So what would you say would be the 3 strongest arguments that you would use, or the 3 first arguments you would use to argue for mythicism? Yeah,
there's all my arguments are kind of wrapped up together in Nailed. One of the final chapters is, can Jesus be saved? And I sort of point out a laundry list of things that would be differently about the Gospels, about the New Testament, about early Christianity, about Roman history, that would be different if there was just a guy named Jesus. And at the end of the book, I said, for me, it boils down to this one paradox, that either this figure said all these amazing things, or at least, it did all these amazing things, or at least taught all these amazing new things, and yet no one noticed for the better part of a century or more, or he didn't do these things, he didn't really teach these things, and yet somehow after he's died, you get all these scattered little house cults, not just in the Galilee, not just in Jerusalem, but all over the Roman Empire, in Alexandria and Rome and Greece and Syria, that can't agree about the first thing about his life.
So
But
it's something to do with the sort of the general silence after his life. That if
and not
okay,
just, it's not just an argument from silence, but it's the things they do say. And it's like, well, that's a weird thing for Paul to say. Why didn't he just say, well, look, I know his brothers. I know his mother. I offer all this proof. Instead, he acts like no one would know about this, if it's a secret hidden in heaven all this time, if not for inspired preachers like him. And
so
even hearing him describe what an apostle is and who the hierarchy of the church is, it's like Jesus' disciples, he never uses the word disciple for anybody in any context ever. Let alone says that Jesus had any. Jesus' brothers and sisters, mother, family, yeah, those categories don't exist when he's describing who's who in the church and where the lineup is.
I think the key is Paul, right? And I think the key to mythicism is Paul. I think the key to actually understanding a lot of the problems with Jesus, whether you're a mythicist or a historicist, is Paul. And the lack of detail you get, and it's difficult because there are only 7 letters that we know for sure, and so the Christian can come back and say, well, just because he didn't say that in those letters doesn't mean he didn't know or say these things in other contexts.
And the more you look at that argument, the less it holds up.
Why?
And to be fair, it's not just Paul; it's the author of the book of Hebrews. That Hebrews is a very strange book on any other thesis than that he's describing a celestial Messiah who does all this up in heaven, and that anything else is just a reflection of that. If you've ever read the Roger Zelazny Amber books, all the other worlds are shadows of the true world. That's very much how the Hebrews, or I should say the early Christians and Jews thought of those levels of heaven. And the closer you got to the real one, the more real it was.
Which Richard Carrier, obviously another famous mythicist, has written Jesus Christ from Outer Space.
Yeah.
Talks about the kind of understanding of the celestial world, which he sees the believers at the time, or the milieu at the time in which the Jesus belief emerged, believing in these ideas of a cosmic.
And I should just point out about that book, don't let the hilarious title fool you, because that book is amazing, and it just breaks down all the argument, the historicist apologetic arguments, and just boom, 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 knocks them out.
Well, I'm not sure. So I've read most of it. I'm reading like 6 books at the moment, but I've read most of it, and it is a great book. But I can't help thinking that it's a great book also for historicists. So I read it and think like 90% of this is just as applicable to debunking claims of Jesus.
Right. And when you say claims of Jesus, you mean from the Jesus of faith?
Yes, exactly. Yes. From Christians.
And that's, that's actually an important point to make too, is like when they talk about things like, oh, well, all historians agree there was a Jesus. It's like, yeah, but Christians, they don't agree that it's your Jesus. Their Jesus that they're talking about debunks your Jesus. So as soon as you say all biblical historians or all Jesus historians, right down the middle, you've got a divide, and their Jesus of faith versus the real Jesus, those two things are just placeholders for a whole family tree of Jesuses going all the way down.
So going back to what you were saying before about, you talked about in Nailed, what would Roman history look like if Jesus had been historical?
Yeah.
What would Roman history look like had Jesus been historical?
Well, all the texts that we have, they're supposed to be proof texts for Christianity. All of them, like for instance, the trial transcripts that we see in Acts. Now, for the most part, I don't trust Acts at all with anything, especially about Paul, because everywhere they overlap, they are in complete contradiction with each other. So, I mean, everything in Acts is shaky for starters. But let's assume, just for argument's sake, that the trial transcripts of Paul and people like Peter are at least based on something legit. If that's the case, look at the way the Romans treat this. They don't say, oh yeah, this is Jesus, that notorious criminal who all of Jerusalem just hailed as their Messiah, and we just crucified, and somehow he disappeared and we haven't found him yet. There's nothing like that. It's all, this is some obscure Jew thing, something about their law, I don't know. It's very funny to read the dismissive way they're just kind of shaking their head at the whole matter.
But as a historicist, as my kind of, maybe it's worth just setting out what my vision of Jesus is compared to, say, yours. My vision is that there was an itinerant preacher called Jesus of Nazareth. He must have been some kind of charismatic leader to some degree, as in he had a following. He went to Jerusalem. He pissed off either the Sanhedrin or the Roman administration to the point where he got executed. And that's that. So that's my Jesus. Okay.
And as far as bare bones historicists, I don't have a lot of problems with it, but we don't really know, because the four Gospels are the only thing we have that offers any real biographical information for him. Everything else is dependent on them. What's worse than that is all four Gospels seem to be dependent on Mark's original Gospel. And that thing seems to be an allegory from start to finish. Even if we just say, well, we know he got executed by the Romans. It's like the historical data that he gives us there makes no sense at all.
What do you mean by that?
For instance, his trial. Nothing about his trial makes sense. And Jewish scholars have been saying this forever. It's like they wouldn't have done a secret trial. They wouldn't have had any of this happen over Hanukkah. They would have put him in jail over the weekend, and the next weekend they would have taken him out and stoned him to death. But that would have been for blasphemy, and nothing he did was blasphemous. It wasn't blasphemy to call yourself a Messiah. You wouldn't have had the chief priest acting as the prosecuting attorney in a trial, because there are no prosecuting attorneys in Jewish trials. And again, Jewish scholars have been pointing out all these mistakes forever and ever. The whole sequence of Pontius Pilate having this custom where he would release a traditional, the Easter Passover release of a prisoner. That's not true. No Roman did that. No Jews did that. Pontius Pilate has no record of doing that, and it makes no sense that he would release a anti-Roman murderer rather than a beloved Jewish preacher. It makes no sense that the Pharisees, who were so terrified of Jesus, all they had to do was give some spirited cheerleading for 2 minutes to turn the entire town that worshiped Jesus as their new king of the Jews into screaming for his blood, saying, no, release this horrible murderer. We want him. This story makes no sense.
And this is where I'm in 100% agreement with you.
Yeah.
I mean, take, for example, Pontius Pilate. And in fact, I have you to thank for a quote that I use in here about the capture and trial. But just before I go and talk about that, the Pontius Pilate letting Jesus Barabbas, as it is in some texts, letting him go, and Barabbas meaning son of the Father.
Son of the Father, yeah.
Jesus Christ, which is known as kind of son of the Father. So it's which Jesus, son of the Father, do we let go? Now, when you understand this in the context of Yom Kippur, which is
bingo,
which is a Jewish atonement ritual where they had two identical goats. They tried to get the goats as identical as possible. They sacrifice one and they send the other out and let it go free.
One is perfect and without blemish. It gets sacrificed. The other carries the sins of Israel of insurrection and murder, and it's released into the wilderness unharmed. Yes. The story that makes no sense historically makes perfect sense point by point by point by point as a allegory for Yom Kippur.
And it gets worse than that for the literalists, because you have Matthew saying Jesus's robe is a scarlet robe, and they tie a scarlet band on the goat that it's, and there's even like evidence that they use a thorny band for the goat as well. There's like loads of references to the crucifixion story of Jesus that can be mapped onto the Yom Kippur thing. So,
and again, this is just one incident in the life of Jesus, and we can do that from start to finish. Yeah. And even things that don't make sense, like him losing his temper at a fig tree for being out of season, that makes no sense for a guy. It makes no sense at all for a divine demigod guy. And yet it makes perfect sense, as this is for an allegory for the Israelites and the Jews and the Christians.
So I think personally, I think what happens is that Jesus was probably an existent person. So it's all about probabilities. So he's probably an existent human being who annoyed some people and got executed. And then you have a short gap to Paul. But and so this is why I say it's all about Paul, because Paul is an early believer. And he is making reference to other real existent early believers, it seems. So you got Peter and James and all this.
Right. So I want to point out something about that relationship between Paul and the early Christian leaders, the leaders of the Jerusalem church. Again, he never implies at all that they have a different relationship to Jesus than he does. In fact, he questions if they're even real Christians at all, which blows my mind. And when he talks about opposing them and not giving in to them for a second, that blows my mind that we never have him doing any kind of apologetic saying, yes, I know these were Jesus's disciples, but blah, 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 blah. Yeah, we never get anything like that.
There's an interesting point there that here is a guy, and I was having a chat with Derek Lambert of Mythicism recently, where we were talking about Paul, because we're talking about the two-body resurrection thesis that I think Paul had, along with what Richard Carrier thinks, as opposed to what the Gospels progressively try and explain, which is it's a full-on body resuscitation, if you like, where it's a corporeal body. But there are some questions coming in from the chats about who Paul was, what kind of character would Paul be, and I think that's an interesting question, which is, like, no matter what you think about the whole Jesus, the ontology of Jesus, who was Paul, and was he a narcissist? Was he after the money? What was motivating him to do what he did? Or was he a genuine believer? And then, so when you're talking about he disagrees with these other early church leaders who supposedly were related to or knew Jesus, what gives him the right as a Johnny come lately to say, I've got it more right than you guys?
Exactly. That's something we never see from Paul. And now, to be fair, everything that we see of Paul comes from those letters attributed to him, only half of which are probably actually by him, and all of which have been redacted, edited, interpolated. And there's probably no letter of his that's not a mashup of multiple letters. But the weird thing is, why just one guy in the whole first century almost of Christianity do we have his writings? Because none of the other half of the writings attributed to him are forgeries, but all the rest of the New Testament seems to be forgeries as well. Peter, John, James, those guys are not the guys who wrote that, and these are coming, generations after the fact. And there's still some interesting things about that. For instance, our letters of Jude and our letters of James. One of the interesting things is they go out of their way to say, oh yeah, I'm James, you know me, Jude's brother. Hey, I'm Jude, you know me, James' brother. None of them say that they're Jesus's brother. That little omissions like that would have been the first thing out of their mouth just blows my mind. And even the letters of Peter, they don't read like anybody who was hanging out with Jesus, because whenever they ask, whenever he tells us about his proof of these things, he punts to the Old Testament, just like all the early Christians do. They're constantly, when they're quoting Jesus, like Clement and Ignatius, they're quoting something from the Old Testament.
Yeah, so as far as I'm concerned, I would agree that I think ostensibly the entire corpus of the writings of Jesus are, I suppose if I was to be technical, I'd say they are legends. So they are legendary embellishment, but they're mythological by point of fact that none of what they claim of Jesus actually happened. So
and that's I don't want to cut you off, but I do want to say that's a super important point to make, that whether there was a Jesus or not, whether Christianity is true or not, all our information about him comes from people who are writing long after the fact, not eyewitnesses, and they're not actually based on anyone who actually existed. So at the end of the day, we're all safer just being agnostics on the Jesus front. In fact, we should be militant agnostics. We should say, yeah, I don't know, and you don't either, because
I think that's a really good point, actually.
And
I don't know whether I would take
Robert Price, actually, who made that point.
Right, yeah, because I would say, like Carrier says, that he's 66%, 67% mythicist, 33% historicist. I would say I'm a 67% historicist, 33% mythicist, but I probably haven't done the figures. That's just intuitive.
Yeah.
But actually, in some sense, I am rather agnostic. Like, I won't die on a hill. I'm not one of these historicists that gets really annoyed about this, and really like takes it personally and has personal attacks against mythicists. Because for me, there is no functional difference between the two positions. And actually, I want to talk to you a little bit about this. But for me, it's like, it doesn't matter, because what you read in the Gospels is entirely fictional.
Bingo.
You know, other than the idea that, if for a historicist, other than Jesus of Nazareth was executed, that's broadly all. So that's like 0.01% of the gospel content.
Absolutely.
Everything is just made up, and then you start thinking, well, okay, so this, as you say, Mark wrote later. Let's assume, I don't know, let's say
the 70s, sometime after the Jewish War, for starters.
So we're talking 40 years, 35, 40 years, right? Somewhere around there. He writes about Jesus, doesn't know him, blah, 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 blah. And he then invents the empty tomb thesis. And he has to include these little things like the women were the first witnesses, but they ran away and didn't tell anyone. Why does it? Because the other gospels, they run away and they tell someone straight away, right? So we've got a big contradiction here. So,
and we've got all those later Christians who said, oh, we can't just stop it there. We need to tack on another ending. So we have multiple endings that people did to fix the problem of him ending it there.
Yes, so 16:9 onwards is written in brackets because it's a later interpolation.
Yeah.
So Mark says that the woman ran away and didn't tell anyone, and this is his explanation as to why no one knew of the empty tomb.
Bingo.
Up to that point. Yeah. So which then says, and this kind of plays nicely into your position, I would say, or into both positions, but
sure.
It's to say that he's invented this whole big part of the narrative there, and just. Yeah, this is what happened because I need that, because I want Jesus to have been a bodily resurrection, because I'm disagreeing with Paul's theology and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But I just think there are these things that go to explain why there was a silence and why things weren't being written in a way that you would have expected earlier.
And his whole silent Messiah motif that scholars have recognized, that plays into that as well. It's like,
what's that?
He's constantly telling lepers, now don't tell anyone about this. Don't tell anyone where I touched you. It'll just be our little secret, But they think that that's that. And meanwhile, John's gospel is complete opposite. He doesn't care who knows it. Why he didn't get stoned for blasphemy right out of the gate, I don't know, because he's constantly saying, I am God. If you've seen God, you've seen me. You've seen God,
Because John is writing so much further down the line that it doesn't really matter. It's like nothing's being affected, and he can put his own agenda fully onto the story.
And even his Jesus dies not so much to save us from our sins, but to prove that he is who he says he is, and it's his ultimate demonstration that I'm God, and because I'll be right back. You watch,
Yeah. So. Given that there isn't much functional difference for someone like me between my kind of historicism and your kind of mythicism, what do you think the ramifications are then for being a mythicist, or not for being a mythicist, but for, I don't know, for the skeptical community at large, or for theology, or,
Sure.
Is there any difference?
And I don't know that there is, honestly. And this is the funny thing. I mean, I've been a out and out mythicist for 20 plus years now. I don't care if there was a Jesus or not. It really is no skin off my nose if there was or wasn't. And if there was more information that made me change my mind, you bet your ass I'd write a book about that, But instead, what I have is all the little things that add up to what made me a mythicist in the first place. I just see more of that. And as I expand my knowledge of other things, and not just from atheists, but also from Christians, because some of the most amazing facts are kind of hidden and talked around in standard reference works. Well, they'll say something, and it's like, dude, did you just hear yourself talk? It's like, how can you, like, for instance, when you read about the book of Acts, they'll say things like, well, the book of Acts is, of course, a rich treasure trove for the theologian, but less so for the historian. It's like, wait, what? what did you just say? They know, that these are myths about Jesus, whether there's a real Jesus or not.
So let's rewind a little bit back to Paul, because again, I just think it all comes down to Paul. What do you think? What kind of person do you think Paul was, and what was going through his mind? Can you imagine yourself as Paul? What were his intentions? What did he know? What do you think he truly believed?
Everything that I say about what I think about Paul comes from what has been given to us through the filter of those editors who edited his letters. And I mean, there's people like Robert Price who think that all of them are forgeries, and they all came around in the time of Marcion, and that's not impossible. And it's weird that we only have Paul during that whole time. We don't have Apollos of Alexandria. We don't have John the Baptist. We don't have, any number of other characters, let alone the 12 disciples. We don't have anything of theirs. That's weird, whether, Christianity is true or not. It's weird that we don't have any kind of history or records other than Acts, which is a bullshit history from start to finish, it appears to be. It's ironic that he starts his thing saying, there's so many people writing gospels now. I thought I would go out and research the story as it comes down to our generation and give you the real deal. And then he mostly steals from Matthew and Mark for his story. The irony is just ridiculous. But Paul, I have some interesting ideas about Paul as a personality. The fact that he's constantly assuring us that he's not lying and that he's not crazy or speaking as an idiot. There's a little bit of the lady doth protest too much. When he gives his proofs of things, you never hear preachers today citing the proofs the way he does. If you ask a preacher, what would Jesus do? Or that's the first thing they do is, well, Jesus said, blah, 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 blah. Paul never does that. He never does anything remotely like that. He always says, well, we know according to scripture that this, and I had a vision in my head that that's his visions, and what he found written in scripture are his answer for everything that he knows about Jesus. And again, he acts like if it weren't for apostles like him and other people and his rivals who he thinks aren't even real Christians, no one would know about Jesus, which I find really fascinating.
But I mean, does this all not talk about the fact that as
Sorry,
early
I keep going down rabbit holes. What do I think he really thought? Yeah. I think he thought Jesus was a spiritual being. I don't think he thought he was ever on earth, or there's a possibility he thought he was some kind of secret agent that no one knew he was on earth, and he was could have been crucified a long time ago, and no one ever even knew it. But he didn't think a guy who did miracles. He didn't think a guy who had miraculous teachings on earth. He acts as though the Jews look for signs, the Greeks look for wisdom, or vice versa, and his Jesus isn't like that. His Jesus is somewhere like the book of Hebrews. That the book of Hebrews, to me, reads like a lot of what Paul was teaching: a crucified Savior, who did all these things in the heavenly realm, in the heavenly temple. That's what he's constantly telling
Paul
us.
clearly says that Jesus died and was buried, and
he says, according to scriptures, he died and was buried. Yes, and that's clearly happening, just like in the book of Hebrews. That's happening in heaven.
So,
yeah. Oh, here's another thing about Paul that's very weird. He constantly is telling us that Jesus is coming. He never says Jesus is coming back. He never implies that there's any kind of a second coming.
That's very interesting. Yeah. So when Paul is making reference to these other early Christians, and again, this is going to be, well, when he's writing, let's assume to the 25 years after the death of Jesus.
Right.
But when he converted, I don't know exactly, but
Yeah.
around this time, the fact that he converted before that, so
Yeah.
when he's writing, he's already, developed some theology and so on and so
Yeah.
forth. So this means that relatively early, if he's going around persecuting Christians supposedly, and that has enough reason to convert from Judaism to Christianity, then that means there must be a network of people around who are strongly believing in some form of Christianity.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. Paul, I want to make this very clear. Paul didn't invent Christianity, nor does he claim to. There were other Christians before him and others in his own family, apparently, who were Christian before him.
So do you think all of those Christians were believing in some ethereal cosmic entity?
I think so. And there probably wasn't one homogenous kind of Christianity then, because the when you look at the way Paul describes his Christianity, he uses a lot of terms from the mystery faiths. And Richard Carey's done a great job of showing how early Christianity, one of its strongest features is that it looks like a Jewish version of these mystery faiths, like any number of other Hellenistic mystery faiths we've seen at the time.
But how, I'm interested in how, and this is not a criticism against mythicism, because actually this is the same question could be asked at literally every single mystery cult, every single actual religion or a mythical religion.
Right.
How do you think if you believe in this cosmic entity, mythicist form of Jesus, how did it actually start? And by start, I mean the very first believers. What were they doing? Were they just making stuff up?
Gotcha. Well, that's certainly what was happening with the Gnostics, for sure. It looks like the further we go into earliest levels of Christianity, you see things like Christians who were singing hymns to Jesus as if he was the first angel. We see hymns we see things like the Ascension of Isaiah, where the earliest levels of it describe a divine figure who is going from heaven to heaven to heaven, being crucified along the way so he could go to the next lower level of heaven. We see a total lack of consistency between these early groups. And these are the writings that survive to today. We don't even know what they found too heretical to keep going. Like, for instance, the Nag Hammadi Gospels that came from the 3rd century, 4th century. One of them is the Sophia of Jesus Christ, the Wisdom of Jesus. It's only half finished, and it's being taken from a pagan tract called The Blessings of Eustanos. And the author of this Sophia of Jesus Christ is taking this pagan dialogue of this pagan writer, this pagan guru and his disciples, and putting them into the mouths of Jesus and Matthew and his disciples. It's amazing. And we're lucky we have that, because they buried them mid-copy. That's why the smoking gun is there for us. We don't have the originals of most of the Christian writings. We're lucky we have the Gospel of Mark at all, because Matthew wasn't trying to set out to write the Gospel according to Matthew. Luke wasn't setting out to write the Gospel according to Luke. All of them were setting out to write the one true Gospel. And Mark was just their source material, one of their source material.
Interesting. Excellent. Thank you for that. So where do you think, what do you think the greatest threat to your mythicist worldview would be? Or what's the greatest historicist argument that you think you need to overcome?
I mean, to be honest with you, I've heard the same arguments thrown again, and they just don't hold up for me. You could say that Paul seems to think that Jesus had a brother named James, but that's not exactly what he says, and that's certainly not how he acts. But that seems to be the one that everybody seems to respond to the most. It's like Bart Ehrman says, well, he knew James, Jesus' brother. He knew Jesus' disciples. And it's like, yeah, that's not exactly true. There's lots of fudged information that everybody knows that don't quite hold up when you kick the tires. And again, if there was information, I mean, I'm not married to mythicism. It's just the thing that I think happens to be true, and it answers the questions better than any other thing. Even Bart Ehrman admits that his failed apocalyptic prophet thesis, which I find perfectly plausible, doesn't explain why the Romans would have crucified somebody like that. Yeah, and none of the other ones do too.
So I mean, could there be? Could he have been crucified because he was literally saying he was king of the Jews, because he was an outspoken cult religious leader that did get the heckles up of the people in charge? I mean, is that plausible?
And again, there's nothing implausible about it. But if that was true, it's weird that we have so much other information about other loser messiahs at the same time who weren't halfway as interesting as what Jesus is in the Gospels, and yet all of them made a dent in the historical record. Jesus doesn't. Robert Price has made an interesting, I wouldn't say he's an argument that he holds, but he made this a suggestion that we know these are myths about Jesus. Could they be myths? Could Jesus himself be a myth about John the Baptist? And when I look at the evidence for John the Baptist and for Jesus, the one thing that kind of puts John the Baptist over the edge of me willing to say, well, maybe there was a John the Baptist, is that he shows up in different forms in every single gospel. And one of those is in Luke. When we first hear the story of John, it's clearly being taken from a Baptist scripture, from his cult, the story of John, because the parts where Jesus and Mary are in there are inserted, and they make more sense when they're pulled out of it. And we can talk about that for a long time too. But there's any number of other messiahs that did make the cut. And it's like, why not Jesus? That's really weird to me.
So do you think the fact that Jesus succeeded as a religion compared to, I don't know, Simon Bar Kokhba or whoever, I don't know, whatever other leader,
any number of others,
do you think it's because you think it's because he's mythical? You think that his mythical nature is actually what enabled the movement?
There definitely was a variety of conceptions of him that tended to get streamlined over time into a more or less orthodoxy. But you can still see all the contradictions in most of our New Testament and the Gospels. There's things that don't quite match up with what they're saying. If you read my book, Mything in Action, I go into that a great deal in both the Gospels and in the New Testament and outside the New Testament, how there's things that just are very weird on the historicist thesis, but make perfect sense on the mythicist thesis.
Yeah. Do you want to talk through, because you've got a trilogy of books, do you want to talk through like what you tried to set out in each of the books?
Sure. Yeah. So my first book was called Nailed, 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All. And I just sort of wanted to go through the top 10, an introduction of the top 10 ways that the official story of Christianity just doesn't hold up. Whether Christianity is true or not, whether Jesus was real or not, this stuff about Jesus clearly is not true. But by that time, I was getting fairly convinced that there probably was not a Jesus at all. For all these reasons that we take for granted, that, eyewitnesses wrote the Gospels. Well, no, they didn't. He was super famous at the time. Well, no, he wasn't. Jesus changed the world with his new radical teachers. No, he didn't. And they weren't original to him. All these things that kept taking Jesus down a peg. And the biggest surprise when that book came out in 2010 was not that the Christians all hated it. That's not special. That's to be expected. But how many atheists said, oh, no, that's pseudo history. That's craziness. That's crackpot stuff. And so that's when 7 years down the line, I wrote Jesus Mything in Action to answer the atheists who were telling me, oh, no, it's crazy to think that there wasn't a Jesus. I know he wasn't God, but there was definitely a dude named Jesus. And I just went through the Gospels. I went through the New Testament, went through outside the New Testament, and just pointed out things. And it's not like these are my ideas. No, I mean, this is all peer-reviewed scholarship stuff that I'm drawing upon, that these just don't add up. And there's more to it going on. And the deeper we go, the weirder Christianity looks, the wiggier it is, and the more it looks like this stuff over here and that stuff over there. The roots go really deep. And again, what I would love, we were talking about Paul. What do I really think Paul believed? I would love to have an interview with Paul, because I think he would blow our minds with what he has to say about his Jesus. I think if we had a time machine, the Roman Catholic Church and the Southern Baptists would team up and slap down that so fast, that nobody would ever know. Because I don't think he thought his Jesus walked around in. And I also think he had some bizarre personal issues that are very interesting and salacious. But
explain.
Well, I'm writing a book right now on sex and violence in the Bible. And when we get into the New Testament part of that, one of the chapters is there's something about Paul. And I don't mean to be snide or homophobic about this, but he clearly, to me, when I read the stuff he says, feels like a self-loathing homosexual. Who would much rather hang out with his beloved partner Barabbas and his beloved slave boy Onesimus and his beloved ward Timothy than do things like touch icky girls. And he wishes all men were like him, perfectly able to resist the temptation of women. And anyway, there's more to it than that, but that's in a nutshell.
So that's an interesting project by the sound of it. Can you do you want to explain? Because obviously that's something people are going to look forward to.
Yeah. On YouTube, a lot of my talks are on YouTube, and I think everyone's favorite is called Sex and Violence. It's called actually Sexy Violence, Violent Sex, the Weird Ass Morality of the Bible. And it's just a fun look at things like all the different gods who are in the Old Testament, all the different monsters that are in the Old Testament, and how the plan of salvation and things like unforgivable sins, all these New Testament things that just don't make sense when you really kick the tires a little bit. So it's a very fun book. I'm trying to finish all these other projects so I can keep focus on that book. But
what are these other projects you're working on?
Well, for instance, we started a new podcast called the Myth of Jesus Christ with David Fitzgerald. And that's a monthly thing that seemed like, a monthly, I can do a monthly thing. That's not going to take up a big bandwidth of time. And yet it's things. The new anthology by Robert Price and John Loftus, The Varieties of Mythicism, I contributed a chapter to that. And I think I'm really proud of that chapter because I think it really lays out what I'm trying to say about mythicism and why it matters and why it doesn't. But
because that goes back to what we were saying earlier, which is, it doesn't really matter if you're a skeptic, right? If you're an atheist, it doesn't really matter. But what were you saying in that?
Well, one thing about it, it's fascinating. It is fascinating. I don't recommend it. You take mythicism to tack down your crank uncle at Thanksgiving, at the dinner table. If you're Christian friends, there's so many other ways to have a conversation because that's just a non-starter. I think it's worth them to know that atheists are debating whether there's a Jesus or not.
It's more technical, I think, than people. It's more technical than people think.
It is.
So that's what it's quite nuanced.
It is, and you really see how atheists know the Bible better than most Bible believers know the Bible, for sure. One of the interesting things that came out in that chapter, Why Mythicism Matters, and the most interesting side effect of going into the historicity question for Jesus is how many times I had Buddhists come up to me and say, yeah, we're having the same arguments in our circles about Buddha. How many ex-Muslims came up to me and said, yeah, we're having the same arguments about whether Muhammad existed. And that blew my mind. And so I did a series of talks recently for Recovering from Religion Foundation. And I made the point, I went a little deeper into that and made the point that when you look at all the top 12 major world religions, all of them show the same pattern of the information about the start, those beginning years, that golden age when they were on earth and starting their religion, are super dodgy and tend to come well after the fact. Like in the case of Muhammad, at least 60 years after the fact. Parts of the Quran seem to predate Muhammad by hundreds of years and seem to come from Syrian Christian hymnals and liturgical writings, things like that. And the fact that all of these religions that we know of, whether you're talking the Eastern tradition, whether you're talking Western tradition, that they all seem to have the same dodgy backstory and their founder figures seem to be 100% mythical. That seems to have important ramifications for Jesus. It makes it seem like this is not a crank idea. This is actually the norm.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's varieties of Jesus mythicism. Did he even exist? And I know even I was speaking to Derek Bennett the other day, who was saying that, you know, he's got a chapter in it, but his chapter, you know, he's a historicist.
Right.
And so therefore, you know, there's a range of work in there. I mean, it does look like an interesting anthology, and one I definitely need to get my hands on. Can I just say thanks to Gnostic Informant Neil? He's a legend. Thank you for contributing, good man. And we have a question here from Festering Boils. So when Paul writes according to the scriptures, is it the same word and definition used in all the gospel headings? The gospel according to Luke.
That's an excellent question. The word that he uses there is kata, and says kata grapha, according to the scriptures. The titles that we have, the gospel according to Mark, according to Matthew, those all came later. The actual title of the gospel of Mark is actually the good news of the story of Jesus, the Son of God. And it's right there in verse 1 of it. All those chapters and all those attributions came later in the 2nd century. And we have other gospels that we know of, because people like Irenaeus were talking about them, early church fathers, where it's a gospel of Matthew or a gospel of Mark, but it's clearly not our gospel of Mark they're talking about. It's clearly not our gospel of Matthew. And it's not until, 150 years after the fact that Irenaeus of Lyons says, oh, no, there's only 4 gospels. And forget all those other 30-something gospels and acts and epistles out there. Because we only have 4.
Yeah, is it? No, it's not Irenaeus. Is it Origen that talks about the Gospel of Matthew? I can't remember if it's Origen or Justin Martyr. Talks about the Gospel of Matthew, but it sounds like he's talking about a sayings gospel, and it isn't actually the Gospel of Matthew as we know it. And so
right, exactly. And I think there was an earlier one, like Papias or somebody like that. But yeah, you're exactly right. It's like they're describing something that was written in Hebrew, not in Greek, describing something that was like a sayings gospel. And Dennis MacDonald gets into that, talking about what that could have been. Yeah. Something like the Gospel of Thomas makes a lot more sense as something like that, because in the Gospel of Thomas, it's not even a gospel, really. It's the secret wisdom collected by Jesus' twin brother, Thomas. And if you know these secrets, then you'll be able to get into heaven. Of course, we don't have the decoder ring to decipher what he's saying when he says the things in there. But back then, somebody did. And that's clearly it's coming from a mystery faith situation.
So what are mystery faiths? What are mystery cults, and how do they influence what we know or think we know about Christianity? Or how do they influence the inferences we can make about Christianity?
Right. And for starters, before I even go too deep in that question, for sure, check out Richard Carrier's book on the historicity of Jesus, because he goes very deep into what a mystery faith is and how early Christianity looks exactly like somebody set out to do a Jewish version of that. That said, in a nutshell, after Alexander the Great's conquests, the Mediterranean world and beyond was sort of the first big cosmopolitan in ways that were kind of unprecedented. And one of the ideas that he did was he didn't outlaw the pantheons of the people he conquered. He just kind of incorporated them into a super pantheon. And later the Romans did this with their own version where, for instance, in Britain, the Celtic god Solus. In Bath, it becomes Solus Minerva. You got all these other gods who come this god / Jupiter or this god / Apollo. So they all, this idea that we're all worshiping the same gods, they just have different names. It's very ecumenical. And we get that. But one of the big ideas that came out of this was not these super pantheons, but the idea of a personal savior God who lived in your heart and walked with you and talked with you. And when you were baptized, into their cult or had their Lord's Supper or Ladies' Supper, we also have those as well. You were part of the club, and just down the line, everything we know about the mystery faiths really maps well onto what the Christians were doing.
Who were the the gods of the mystery faith? Who are the
generally they would take one particular god out of their pantheon. So like there was an Isis mystery faith. There in Thracia there was a Mithras. There was Dionysus. I'm skipping on it, but there were many. There were several.
My point of saying that is that they are taking existent gods.
Yes.
So there isn't a case of people sitting down and making up a god to start.
Well, that's not entirely true, because Serapis, for instance, is a totally made up god who's a mixture of Zeus and some other gods, including Jesus, for that matter. But not to get too far down that road. They would take an existing god, but the new mystery faith version of that god was just sort of a rebooted version. So
that's what I'm trying to say about mythicism is one of my issues is going back to how did it really start? Like who sat down and because this is something that popped up around the time that Jesus would have been living, right?
Or possibly earlier. For instance, Philo of Alexandria, he's one of the first Jewish intellectuals to really blend the Hebrew tradition with Greek thought. And he was very influential. The idea of the Holy Spirit really comes directly from Philo. And some other, what we think of as really mainline cornerstone Christian thoughts actually come from Philo.
So the idea that whether it be a little bit before or whatever around that time, I'm just interested in how, like, because for me it's more intuitively plausible that a human being who people thought was the Messiah, genuinely was a Messiah figure, that he had a following who thought he was a Messiah. He ends up getting executed, and then they have the whole cognitive dissonance. Oh my goodness, what's going on here? And then out of that, it seems really plausible to me that loads of myths emerged, right?
Sure.
And I can understand it happening. But if I don't have that, then I have to have someone sitting down and making up because Jesus isn't a pre-existing entity,
right?
Like some of the mystery cults have, like a pre-existing divinity. So I'm just struggled to work out whether it's more plausible that someone sits down and makes stuff up,
gotcha,
rather than applies a load of made up stuff to someone who existed.
But here's the thing: it's not such a stretch as you think, because the Jews, they have one big sky daddy, Jehovah. So Jesus is not a reboot of Jehovah. He's a Jewish version of Hercules or some son of Apollo, or he's a demigod. That idea makes a lot more traction, and they take his voice as things from Zechariah or the Psalms or Isaiah, fill in the blank. That becomes him speaking to them from heaven.
Right. So
they explicitly say this. We have early Christian fathers explicitly saying that, basically.
So it's okay. Well, I mean, I think it's interesting that Justin Martyr says why do you not believe all this stuff? Because it's
just like you're saying about the sons of Jupiter. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And I think that's just a really interesting argument against Christians who say, this is something that's so different. That's why it's a real and existent thing. Because but
honestly,
saying, as you know, it's not. It's pretty much.
And here's the thing. At the end of the day, if there was a real failed Messiah that Jesus was based on, that's fine. I just don't see it. I just don't see it. It makes more sense because everything we see are coming from literary analogies, literary allegories, I should say. And so it doesn't, the difference between like somebody like Julius Caesar who gets deified and then has all these legends erupt is when you scrape away all the mythological stuff, there's still residue of a human being behind it. But when you do that with Jesus, we've got nothing. That's the thing. Or
do we have? Literally, because in my nativity book, to which you superbly wrote the foreword, everyone should go and buy that.
It's a great book.
So in that, talk about how you have the issue that Luke and Matthew, who are the authors of the only two gospels that recount the nativity of Jesus, you have these two writers go, right, Jesus is from Nazareth. So we have Jesus of Nazareth, and we have to get into Bethlehem because we've gone and trawled through the Old Testament to find out, you know, a prophecy that we think applies to the Messiah, and therefore he has to be born in Bethlehem. I would deny that that's actually the case, but
absolutely.
So they have this problem of getting him to Bethlehem and then back to Nazareth because everyone commonly knew him as Jesus of Nazareth. How would a mythicist explain this?
Right. There's a lot to unpack in there. First of all, the fact that we've got the story from Matthew and the story of Luke, and these are not the same story at all. They don't match up at all.
True.
Which is something
Apart
interesting.
From Jesus of Nazareth. I mean,
and here's the thing.
That's the point.
Jesus of Nazareth, and I talk about this in Jesus Mything in Action, by the way. And it was actually a Christian scholar, James McGrath, who I butt heads on fairly regularly, it seems. But he's the one who pointed out that when you read the Greek of the Gospel of Mark, our first gospel, he never actually says Jesus of Nazareth. No matter how it reads in our English translations, he says things like Jesus the Nazorian, Jesus the Nazarite, Jesus. It's a sect leader title, just as Paul is accused of being a ringleader of the Nazorians. There is no connection to Nazareth until the Gospels later Gospels make that. And as you say, they tie it to Nazareth. But even, I was going to say, we have to be careful with that because they don't always make that same connection either. And Christopher Hitchens did the great argument saying, this feels real to me because there's the humbugness of it. There's this historical, inconvenient historical truth that they had to work around. And the thing is, they did have to work around what Mark said, but they had to work around it because he had a scriptural prophecy that put it in Nazareth.
So you think, so just to get this right,
you had other ones that put in Bethlehem and other ones that could have been in places like Cana and Capernaum. You know, any of those places could have worked as the real birthplace of Jesus.
So you think it was a case of looking at one of these kind of trawled so-called prophecies saying that Jesus was a Nazarene or one of these iterations,
and that's a misunderstanding that became deliberate later. And I should reread that chapter so I'm getting the nuances correct in that. But the earliest indications of that don't say that they're saying Jesus of Nazareth. We say that.
Yeah,
they didn't say that.
When you start, so this is interesting. So when you, as a mythicist, can explain away Jesus of Nazareth, which is basically the only, well, you've got James and Peter along with Paul, but then you've got Jesus of Nazareth, and that's the only kind of historical, geographical thing that ties Jesus to a real person. And if you can explain that away, as you have done there, you think adequately, then actually you've just sliced away the last thing that tethers Jesus to
because it's worth pointing out that we don't have any time frame for Jesus. There's nothing that says that we can pinpoint with any accuracy or confidence any single event in his life. For instance, as you well know, Matthew and Luke have a difference of 10 years at least. Not that any other part of their story matches up at all either, but that's how loosey-goosey these details and this biographical information is. It's like they're swinging out in completely different worlds, and somehow for our Christmas specials we've managed to mash up both stories as if they make sense together.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you, Kirk Marshall. So really generous. Love it. Does Paul mention persecuting Christians in his letter, or is it only mentioned in Acts? Love you both. Happy minimal solar
Thank you, Kirk, and Merry Christ Myth to you too.
Nice. You've even got your own catchphrase for this time of year.
I believe that Paul does mention something in his letters. It's interesting that he never mentions his conversion story in Damascus. Luke gives us 3 conflicting versions of that. Paul never says anything remotely like that. It happens to him. Another reason I would love to sit down for an interview with the real Paul and get his unfiltered words about what he thinks Christianity is and who Jesus is. But it does seem like sorting through what's true in fiction about Paul's biography is tricky too. But it does seem like he was a Pharisee, I don't know if he was a Sanhedrin. I don't know if he really knew Gamaliel. But it does seem like he was involved with persecuting Christians. Or maybe it's just that inflated, I was such a huge sinner and now I'm a saint phenomena that we get even today.
Funnily enough, we get that within sort of arguing as atheists with Christians. It's like, yeah, I used to be an atheist. Lee Strobel. It's like former atheist.
Don't get me started on Lee Strobel. Don't get me started on him. What a liar. You're a liar. I need to write a book just about that. What a huge, massive liar Lee Strobel is.
Name his biggest lie.
The fact that he was a tough skeptic and then he went out and investigated it because he had to investigate because he's a tough skeptic and invested in all these guys, and then at the end he was so blown away by the evidence that he became a Christian. He was a Christian preacher for 10 years before he even thought of interviewing these guys for this book. And even when he interviewed them, one of them after the fact was talking to a acquaintance of mine who asked him, "Did you really say this?" And he says, "Well, I didn't actually say that. That's something Lee Strobel said I said." It's like, man, you are kidding me. That's why they all sound alike, because it's all Lee Strobel's voice coming from him.
Yeah. Oh, there's a YouTuber that wants to interview me who's a Catholic, who said, yeah, I was a former atheist, and then I dealt with all the ideas and grappled with them, and then found that the Christian ideas are much better. It's like, what age were you when you deconverted? 17. All right, so at the age of 17, you really understood atheism and all the philosophical arguments. Jesus, I didn't know my ass from my elbow at the age of 17.
And they never tell us what these arguments were. They never tell us what these amazing arguments were, or this amazing. It's like, tell me that, and then we'll talk.
Yeah. So this is a similar question from Brian Vinci. What could have been Paul's motivation for conversion then to evangelism? I presume that is.
That's a great question. And I only have speculation because honestly, we have to be really careful that we think we know anything about Paul, really. Because again, everything we know about his writings shows that they've been edited, re-edited, mashed up, interpolated. My guess is it's one of those situations where you go from sinner to saint. I think he really did believe that he found Christianity speaking to him through the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures, because he constantly tells us about that. I think he has some personal issues.
Which can I just jump in there? I had an interview with Dr. Kip last night, and he was talking about Kip Davis, Dr. Kip Davis, and he was talking about how it really was the Jewish custom to sort of like pesher, to reinterpret and like create new ideas out of existing scriptures, to which the Pauline root you can understand in that Jewish context.
Yeah, absolutely. Peshers, midrash, they're all allegory. And there's a great chapter verse, and we're getting into a rabbit hole. I apologize to Brian but there's a great verse right at the beginning of Mark where he actually has his Jesus say, "Now, I'm teaching you in parable. I'm teaching through parables, but I'll tell you the real secret. Otherwise, everyone else who's not in our little club would understand and know and repent from their sins and be saved." It's like, and this is still in our Bibles. It's like he's saying this is a mystery faith that's just for the inner crowd. That's not our Jesus. That's not our Jesus who came to earth to save everybody. That's a mystery faith Jesus.
I think David Madison's recent book, Things Jesus Taught, I forget the title of the book, which is
I think it's the X number of things that Christians wish Jesus hadn't taught.
Yeah, and I think he does include that one, where a whole bunch of them where Jesus says just really uncomfortable things, and everyone these days is like, "Oh no, I won't talk about that one in church. We'll talk about this one where he talks about love and everything."
I'm glad you brought that up, because I wrote the foreword to that book as well, and they only used half of the foreword, and I think I'm going to have to publish somewhere in probably my Patreon page the whole thing where I talked about. He talks about the four walls around what we can know about Jesus. And I added a bunch of moats to those walls saying, that's not just that, but it's also this, and this, and this, and this.
So yeah, interesting. So thank you, Brian. I think Paul.
Wait.
Yeah.
Before we get away, so Brian, I didn't answer your question really. I mean, I don't know, but I have some ideas, and I think probably his guilt for persecuting the Christians at some point may have played a part in him becoming a Christian. We also know he talks about kinsmen of him. We don't know if they mean just Jews in general, or if he had actual family members who were who were Christians. But that's also another possibility. And so with so many other things in the New Testament, we have all these possibilities, and some are more plausible than others. But as far as proof and as far as certainty, we have to be kind of.
I think people convert or deconvert quite often, or most often, for psychological reasons. With I was talking about this yesterday, but in terms of Paul's conversion, there will have been things like, whether it be family members, whether it be this or that, there would have been so many things we just can't know as to why he converted, and it's not going to be probably the rational force of the arguments for that theology, because the theology had
clearly not.
He was the one who developed the theology.
Exactly. And it seems to be that's where he's coming from. He's like, Lord talked to me in my head today, and I'm telling you this, Lord said this to me,
because you're right. Because one of the things about Paul is his main source of revelation is personal revelation, i.e. visions, dreams, speaking to God, whatever that might be, and scriptures.
And this happens. We know this because according to scriptures, he died on the third day. We know he rose from the dead according to scriptures. Everything he knows about Jesus is according to scriptures.
Yeah, and then one of the things I say, and you could say this it falls into evidencing your position, is that what we know about Jesus, what I say in this book, and the silence of Paul, what we know about Jesus from Paul is so minimal, that it is rather bizarre. It's a problem for the Gospels.
It is, especially when all he had to do was quote Jesus on a certain matter, and that would have solved it. Or when he disagrees with Jesus on a certain matter, it's like, why are you disagreeing with Jesus?
Absolutely. Yeah, really good point. So Nick Ross says, by the way, that book has been written, by the sounds of it. Dr. Bob Price has written the case against the case for Christ.
Well said. And I yes, big thumbs up on your question answer and Bob Price's book. Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. But still, you could just add to that, David. Just get writing. Smash it, because he seems to
mostly it's for me it's Lee Strobel's the movie based on the Case for Christ. Oh, what a crap fest that movie is.
It's like God is not dead and God is not dead too, and all this kind of like. But the problem is that there is a market for them, and if you can make them cheap enough, they're not going to make enough.
See, this is what we need to do, Jonathan. We need to write a book saying, I was a big atheist, and then all of a sudden I realized, no, wait, there is a Jesus, and it's incredible. Just write that, and then write another book saying, But
isn't that funny? Because what happened is that kid who wrote the book with someone who went to heaven, right?
Who went to heaven, yes.
And then he experienced heaven, and they wrote a book, and it's all massive, and all these talk shows are talking about it. And then, like 5 years later, it's like, yeah, no, that didn't happen. Like,
I'm just a little kid. I went in too deep. Yeah, and it's another case of where like the front headline screams this, and then 5 years later, page 18, buried in the back, takes it away. Same with all the archaeological evidence for Jesus or evidence for the Old Testament.
So Kurt Marshall says that's a great book, 10 Things Christians Wish Jesus Hadn't Taught.
And Kurt, I'll just add to that, his original book that David Madison wrote, 10 Top 10 Problems in Christian Belief. I'm mangling your titles, Dave Madison, and I love you. But yeah, Dave Madison's books and his weekly, semi-weekly podcast, blog posts, they're amazing. They're fantastic, and those are the things you should be mailing to your Christian uncles and cousins and pals, because they just pack a wallop every time.
It's the thing I like about. I'm so busy these days that I have so many books, right? And I have 5 times as many books electronically as I do in paperback or hardback, and I just don't get time to read because, and you would know this as a fiction writer as well as a non-fiction writer, is that whenever I have a spare moment, I'm writing, right? I'm
Right.
not reading. And so
Right.
like there are all these books I should be reading, but I don't have a chance because I'm doing the writing myself. And it's just like, it's so frustrating.
And it's really annoying when a Christian says, oh, well, you clearly haven't read Dr. Blah, blah, blah's book on blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, I have not read every single Christian apologetic thing, but I have read every single Christian apologetic argument. That's for damn sure.
Yeah. Yes. Well, speaking of which, what is the most challenging, I suppose this is a philosophical question, what's the most challenging argument for God that, or what's the hardest thing for you to think about in terms of being an atheist? What's the thing you grapple with the most?
You know, I don't think there is one. It's like, I'm pretty much done with that guy. And it's one of those things like, as soon as I stopped being a Christian, it seemed really obviously fake. It just seemed really obvious in hindsight. Well, of course evolution is true. Why was I making such a fuss all those years? Of course it's true. Yeah, that's really funny. It seems so, all of them, not just Christianity. I won't just pick on Christianity. All of them seem super, super fake and driven by this combination of wishful thinking, drinking your own Kool-Aid, money and power down the line. But none of them seem to start out for money and power. They all seem to be, look, God talks to me. I'm super special. And people, I say things and they listen to it. You know, that seems to be the most across the board biggest motivation of anybody saying anything about any kind of God or gods or goddesses.
Think there's what, a narcissism or a sense of self-importance?
Well, I mean, there's a like guru mentality, and there's a prophet mentality, and the psychology seems really consistent no matter when you're talking about in history, where, what religion, what the dogma is, theology. Another thing I did this year was I talked about the evolution of religions. And I started with books like Daniel Dennett's Breaking the Spell and David Sloan Wilson's Evolution for Everybody, and talked about these things that are even before we were human that enabled magical thinking and things that are evolutionary survival mechanisms that were easily co-opted by religions. And then Robert Wright came out with a book called The Evolution of God that just really dovetailed so nicely with what I was saying about how these are man-made things. And he broke it down by stage. Like, first, primitive religion, there is no religion. It's just everybody knows the sun is a big god, and everybody knows that, the wind is a monster that breathes, fire and things, these things. And it's so fascinating to see how widespread it is. He goes Siberia, South America, Polynesia, Europe, and you see these same trends. And you go from that to the shaman stage, where you get this specialist who develops in, he does healing and he speaks to the gods. And then sooner or later he'll link up with a chieftain, and by then you've got agriculture, and then you get the chieftain level, and chieftains grow into big city states. And by the time you get city states, you need writing and mathematics and record keeping and astronomy rather. And you see all these things to support a religion / state. And then these things go from being monotheist to either polytheist or universalist, where there's just one God for everybody. And it's interesting how the verses that were, my God will smite you and your false God, can become, my God loves you and everybody equally, and he's the only one true God. And the smiting verses and the God loves everybody verses, their emphasis goes back and forth through time, depending on whether you can get along with this other religion or not. It's fascinating.
I think it's interesting when you look at the evolution of religion and how it ties in with politics as well, by point of fact that okay, we have to do all these sacrifices to keep the gods happy, but the priests who do the sacrifices have the most meat, and it's all about the priests are just perpetuating. It's a bit like the modern iteration of that would be the Vatican and all its vast wealth. And
when you go to the lowest levels, where you first have the first shamans, they're happy to do ventriloquism and sleight of hand, and they're happy to call out their other rival guys. Oh, he's fake, but But
because they will get given the gifts, you know, come and give me a reading, and I'll give you. They're in a position of power, and it's perpetuating that by you know, but maintaining that myth, because you might. It's like doing the Derren Brown. You might know that you're fooling them, but man, you are making it. Yeah, I'm not going out and working on the fields. I'm sitting in my tent all day smoking.
And
some
I think there's also an element in a lot of cases of self-delusion. They forget that they're making it all up, and they think maybe I am. You know, this amazing, incredible prophet.
What I was going to say earlier, to the thing that keeps me up at night, is the only thing that worries me is equally applicable to a theistic worldview, which is, why is there something rather than nothing? I think that's the one that makes me go, ooh, and makes my brain melt. It's like,
and I see Nick Ross is asking that too.
And
here's the thing: if there was nothing, we wouldn't be here to ask this question.
It's just a brute fact.
Maybe nothing is unstable, intrinsically unstable. Yeah.
Well, or you could do a probability. I don't know if this really works, but you could say, how many ways are there of there being nothing? Well, one way. How many ways are there of being something? Well, infinite ways. Therefore, is more likely there's going to be something. I don't know. I don't know if that works.
And sooner or later, all our something in this universe will become nothing again. It's like once the stars die out and everything titters away.
Or it will at least become arguably a heat death of the universe.
Sure.
We'll see.
But we've got a good 3 trillion years or so to live it up while we can. So even the universe has that problem, not just us.
Yeah, true that. So as we start moving towards wrapping it up, let's start talking about your experience with fiction writing.
Oh, sure.
And how you got into that, what the difference is between fiction and non-fiction writing, what you find easier and harder, and whether you ever want to deliver certain themes, and ideas that are connected to the work you do in your non-fiction writing.
Right. Well, it's funny because right now I'm a science fiction writer. And I think even as a kid, I always knew I was going to one day be a science fiction writer. But in actual fact, my writing fiction career started with writing erotica, because my wife wrote erotica. And when we were dating, we were writing erotic short stories for each other. And then one day, without telling me, she took one of my stories, gave it to her publisher and say, hey, what do you think of this guy's stuff? And so I had a whole writing career of writing erotica. And for a while, my cocktail party joke was, I write biblical history and erotica. Guess what sells better? Joke was on me. Nailed. Wound up selling way better than anything I'd ever written erotica. I was an award-winning erotica writer by that point.
Wow.
So now I don't have really time to write erotica. But that's where that started, ironically enough. But the thing I'm most proud of in my nonfiction is the Time Shards trilogy, which is time travel, but it's not really time travel. It's more of I call it a schizochronolinear apocalypse story. It's where the timeline shatters in this thing we call the event. And part of the mystery in the book 1 is, well, what just happened? Because it's a post-apocalyptic novel in that the timeline shatters, but all of these pieces come back together. And so you've got this planet that over here, it's 2020. Over there, it's 1492. Over there, it's 5 million BC. And so all the characters in the first book, there's this ragtag group of people from all these different time periods. And one of the fun things in book 1 is the 2 main characters, they don't have a language in common for the entire first book. It was an idea I had in college for a role-playing game. And it's where you can have a character from any timeline you want, and whoop, we drop them on this post-apocalyptic world where, around the corner, you can just about bump into anything. And really about the only rule we made was we made it geographically stable. So if you are, as in book 1, you're in England or Britain, you're not going to run into samurai. You're not going to run into gauchos or giant robots, maybe. You'll only land on things that were there. And it's super, super fun. normally when I'm writing nonfiction book, I like to do a fiction project after that because the processes are so different. Like with nonfiction, you have to have footnotes, you have to have citations, you have to do research, and everything has to be laid out just so. Whereas in a fiction book, you don't have to do any of that, but you have to make everything up. And sometimes the nonfiction seems really easy. You just plug in this, and fiction, it seems infinitely harder.
So I've written 3 fiction books, and I've written a dozen plus non-fiction books. And non-fiction write themselves sometimes.
Exactly.
Just the arguments write themselves, and you're just going along, and then you're just referencing what you're arguing with reference to other authors. And
I feel like I'm making a quilt. I feel like I really didn't do anything about this. I'm just framing all these other arguments. Like making a mosaic. Yeah,
exactly. And I find, so I've written, which you haven't read yet, but you will do, I'm sure. God damn it! But I've written 2 sort of fiction books myself. Well, I've written 3, but one's for younger.
My wife is reading book 1 as we speak, so that's why I haven't had much of a chance to get around to that one.
So that's Survival of the Fittest, Metamorphosis, and Adaptation, and they are pandemic horror books. But with me,
which is just right up our alley. We love it. Yeah.
So what I wanted to do is deliver philosophy in the fiction. So I wanted this to be, and we're talking about sort of post-apocalyptic context. It's the easiest way to deliver moral dilemmas, to deliver all sorts of philosophy. So that's why I chose that. It's just a really good vehicle to deliver all these big ideas. That when you're reading it, you are reading fiction, and you're getting enjoyment, but you're also thinking every so often about that's and actually I've done that in my kids' sort of young adult Curse of the Mire.
Cool.
So that's used up and down the country as a core textbook in English schools. So
that's fantastic.
Which is fantastic. But there's something called P4C in Britain called Philosophy for Children. So in that I try and get like P4C ideas, like, so that they're reading, but then every so often they get this kind of like stop and think moment of like, whoa. As a kid,
the tippling philosophers of the future today. I love it.
That's it. So with your Time Shard series and all the other fiction writing, is there any of your non-fiction ideas you want to deliver in that, or not even to deliver the conclusion, but to get the readers to think?
What I tend to do, and I did this with my erotica too, oddly enough, because I wouldn't try to beat anybody over the head with
what
this
was it like?
That.
Oh Jesus! But actually, I did like Jesus existed.
But I did like slipping in little things, and mostly in Time Shards. Mostly it was just seeing something from somebody else's point of view, and it's like, I never thought of it that way, The funny thing when you were saying that earlier, it made me think that, there's a process to writing fiction, and then there's a process to writing nonfiction. But when you write a time travel nonfiction, suddenly you have to make up everything, and you have to do all the research that you did. So in that way, it was probably the hardest thing to write, because I had to make all this stuff up, and I had to make sure it was all historically accurate. But it was so rewarding, so much fun, and I have writer friends who tell me when they write it, I couldn't stop thinking about this book, and when they're describing the places that the characters go to, it feels like they're really there, and that just made us feel delighted.
And I suppose, in a sense, you get more reward out of someone congratulating you on a fiction thing, because it's entirely of your own.
Absolutely so.
Mental construction, as opposed to a non-fiction book where you're delivering ideas that already exist in some form or another. You're just synthesizing them, and then
the imposter syndrome is a lot stronger with non-fiction, because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. Big time.
Yeah, absolutely. So the final kind of thing to talk about tonight, before we get onto the quick fire questions I've got for you. So the final thing is the Nativity, because it is that time of year.
Yes.
And let's just remind everyone, because why not?
Why not?
You wrote the foreword to this fantastic book, The Nativity, A Critical Examination. So what are your favourite nativity arguments that show that the whole thing is legendary, embellishment, or myth?
If I had to just point to one, it's the basic impossibility of these two stories being coherent. It's like, maybe Matthew was right, maybe Luke was right, maybe they're both wrong, but they can't all be true because they are telling completely different stories with no attempt to even try to match the other. Like I said, they weren't setting out to write the gospel according to Matthew, the gospel according to Luke. They were all setting out to write the one true gospel.
So given that the gospels are codependent, what's your view on whether Luke had access to Matthew or Matthew to Luke, or both independent but drawing on Mark?
Great question. You are aware of this, but for the readers who don't know, there's a thing called the synoptic problem. And it's not really a problem unless you think that all the gospels are independent sources. Then it's a big problem. But for us, it could be the synoptic interesting situation that if you take the first three gospels, they are clearly using the oldest gospel, Mark, as a basic structure, and they're taking it and expanding on it. And sometimes they expand on it in completely incompatible, contradictory ways. And that said, there's all these different theories floating around to solve the synoptic problem. And some of them involve what's called Markan priority, that Mark was written first. And some involve Q, which was, there was this other hypotheticized scripture source that we've never found, but that's where you see Luke and Matthew are agreeing against Mark. So, and it's very convoluted, and I'm along with those scholars who say there was no such thing as Q. That's just where Luke is stealing from Matthew and Mark.
I think I agree with you. So listening to Mark Goodacre recently again.
Exactly. Thinking, and the Farrar hypothesis as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, Mark Goodacre is a scholar these days who's now has for a good decade or a couple of decades been saying that the Q source, it doesn't exist, and actually the simplest hypothesis is actually the best, and he's got some really good reasons for that, which is that actually Luke stole from, or Luke steal from you. Mark was first, Matthew then largely used Mark, and Luke used Mark and Matthew, and then John.
And I think you can say stole. I think because it's pure plagiarism, And what's worse is he intends to supplant it. They all intend to supplant it. Even the other gospels we've seen, like the Gospel of Peter, which no one's ever heard of, they're trying to write the one true gospel. They're not trying to make supplemental material.
Yeah. So what do you think explains the difference in the nativity accounts if Luke was using Matthew? Do you think Luke ditched Matthew's nativity account, or do you think it was a later interpolation and added by someone who wasn't Luke? In which case, why is there still a difference, or what?
Well, I mean, they're both possible, but whoever it was responsible for that final judgment call, they did not give two hoots about the others' nativity stories, whether they were aware of them or not. Here's the other thing: is we only have the latest version of these gospels, but clearly these things evolved over time too. You just have to look at the multiple endings on John and Mark and Luke to know that these were not static documents, and people felt totally free. Bart Ehrman's book, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, and for that matter, Forgery and Counterforgery in Christianity, does such an amazing job of like the scribes and monks and Christians felt totally free to make corrections and insertions and mistake liner notes for actual text. And we see that very well documented.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to share with you on the screen now. I wrote a blog post some time ago called, Luke 1 and 2 infancy narratives as a later interpolation. So I personally think that Luke is an interpolation. Great scholars like Raymond Brown would say, as a Catholic exegete, would say it was an interpolation, but it was Luke himself who did that later. But other people say actually the Greek used is different, blah, blah, blah. But I think it's really interesting. Right. So if you start Luke's gospel from chapter 3, he starts by saying, basically, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius, when Pontius Pilate was blah, 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 the word of the Lord came to John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness. And it reads as if that's the absolute start of the gospel.
Right. And I absolutely agree. That is where that gospel needs to start.
Yeah.
If you take out the first 2 chapters,
and the genealogy,
which is a longer story, by the way, that's clearly coming from a Baptist source.
Yeah.
There's just no mistaking it at all. Yeah.
So and the genealogy then comes next, which is what you'd put at the beginning. So I think it's really clear that Luke's nativity, I think, is a later interpolation.
Sure.
And then it's like, well, why, if you had access to Matthew, why would you, it's interesting to wonder why they would just go, well, broadly, this story agrees, in Jesus' life, but I'm going to tack on a nativity.
And again, look how Luke starts his. He says, so many people writing gospels now. I went in and he pulls a Lee Strobel. I'm going to do a tough investigation and see what the real story is. And so he's going to give you the real scoop.
And I think it's just genuinely trying to understand how these gospels were written, which is they were in different communities of people who had all this theology that maybe been created by the community over a decade or so, and they wouldn't have had. So John hadn't been written yet. They would have only had, if you're Luke's community, right? They would have had maybe Matthew and Mark to draw on. And
hang on a second, because you just said something very interesting. You just said, it's worth pointing out that for the first 150 to 200 years, we don't have anything except tiny fragments for the most part. Over a century later, we don't know how these documents originally read or how much more there was that didn't make the cut. So that's important to realize too. That,
and you got the Marcionite interpretation of, so you've got also, you're absolutely right. So you've got these different communities and they don't have access to all the other writing. They've maybe got access to certain iterations of certain writings.
Yep.
And therefore, and then they have their own sort of rituals possibly, and they have their own
emphases they wanted to make.
Emphases and cultures and little elements of their own, community. Absolutely. And then they write the thing that best represents their ideas. But then, a few hundred years later, you've got a whole bunch, and they cut them down to 4. But
it's worth pointing out that, ignoring spelling mistakes and grammar mistakes, which that's not special, no 2 single manuscripts of the New Testament agree with each other 100%. None, not a single one. And sometimes those differences are amazingly, mind-wreckingly different. And there's the deliberateness with which they are changed to say the opposite of what it originally said.
I think Hector Avalos wrote a book called The End of Biblical Studies, which is a fantastic book that looks into all of that great variety.
That book is a must read, absolute must.
It is a really good book. You get the kind of understanding when you start trying to. Again, we were saying this earlier about who Paul was. It looks like I have lost David, but what I was trying to say, and hopefully he'll drop back in, is when you start understanding the human genesis of these pieces of writing, you start understanding how they.
Lost you there, Jonathan.
Yep, you're back in, so that's cool. Sorry, I'll repeat that. So just as I was saying earlier with Paul, when you start understanding the human genesis of these pieces of writing, and you start wondering what it must have been like to write these things and how they came about, you start understanding that the problem is, as Christians and believers, you read the Bible as if it was written intentionally in the way it reads, like some complete book. Like some authors sat down and gone, right, I'm going to write the New Testament now, and it's all going to be entirely coherent and cohesive.
Right.
And it's like, no, it's a whole bunch of different communities over hundreds of years writing this stuff and editing it and it getting thrown together. And then people later on going, oh, my goodness, how do we make this coherent?
And the Old Testament is just as bad, if not worse. Randall Helm's book, The Bible Against Itself, amazing job of showing where not just does the Bible not just have a single message, but you can actually see it fighting in real time with itself. in Pauline letters, in Old Testament prophecy, in Old Testament history, or pseudo history rather.
So I'm writing a book which is a third in my trilogy of a critical examination books, and it's on the Exodus. It's the Exodus, a critical examination of the Moses story, and,
nice.
And doing a lot of work on a documentary hypothesis and these multiple sources is exactly right. The idea that if you think the New Testament's bad, man, you should take a look at the Hebrew Bible, because that is.
My Sex and Violence in the Bible book, I'm trying to just use the creme de la creme of that, so it doesn't become a huge brick of a book. I tell you what, when you try and write a justice, I wrote a section in a chapter on the documentary hypothesis, and you're like, okay, how do I make this concise? When you're trying to write a chapter on how the Torah was written, you're like, this takes like a 900-page book, and I've got to do it in it's 3 pages. You're not wrong. You're not wrong. When I set out to write this book, Sex and Violence in the Bible, one of the things I really wanted to get into was the historicity of, not the historicity, but the
historical genesis.
Well, the when was it written, the dating question, and who wrote it and why. And I was all set to go down this path, and then I bumped into Russell Gummerkin, from Derek Lambert. Tell me, have you read Russell Gummerkin? And he blew my mind. It's like, he makes such a good argument that so much of what we think of as the Old Testament didn't come about until the same time as the Septuagint did in year 270. He can even pin it down to the year. It's like, that blows my mind.
Yeah, and I was talking to Kip Davis yesterday, who's a Dead Sea Scrolls expert, and of course, there's a lot in the Dead Sea Scrolls to that you can glean about what you're saying, which is the late, and the variation that existed, the variety that existed in those Hebrew Bible scriptures and fragments. But anyway. Thank you so much so far. I'm going to bring this to a close, if that's okay. But I've got some quick fire questions for you.
Oh, let's do it. I'm going to see if I can turn you up a little higher, because I'm losing the sound a little bit. All right, go for it.
I've been trying to speak really loudly, so everyone's probably hearing me half shouting. But just a few questions. What's your favorite non-fiction book? And you can't think of it.
Why don't you ask me who my favorite child is? Oh my goodness.
That's
favorite
next.
nonfiction book. Can't do it. I can't do it. All the ones we've mentioned today, for sure, on the Jesus train. I'm sorry.
Can't do it. So question 1 was a cop-out. Favorite fiction book?
Also very tough. I really love Gene Wolfe's Shadow of the Torturer series. I think that as a book series, that really blew me away with what you can do with a book. There's authors that I really love, like science fiction authors like Rudy Rucker and Bruce Sterling, all the cyberpunk guys, Madeleine L'Engle, Ursula K. Le Guin. Just the list goes on all day. I can't even pick a favorite genre, let alone my favorite book. It's like,
okay, so this one will be easier for you. I see you struggled with the first 2. So it's Christmas time.
Okay.
Right now, if you're watching this in the middle of summer, it's not Christmas time, but it was Christmas time when we were recording. So what's your favorite Christmas song?
Favorite Christmas song? I really loved God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen as a kid, because it's kind of sinister and bombastic, and I don't know why it struck a note for me as a kid.
I edited a book of atheist and humanist poetry called Filling the Void. And in one of the last ones in here is someone who's rewritten God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen as a tongue-in-cheek sort of alternative reading of that carol. And so I just thought I'd throw that one in there. Another brilliant book, obs. How about
in general, I do like the Christmas songs best of all the hymns. I think they got more going on.
How about Christmas pop song?
Ooh, Christmas pop song. There's a great album called.
Oh, he's gone. He can't.
My favorite songs and ones I hated, but
so I missed that. You broke up.
Maybe this Christmas. What's that?
You broke up and I missed that. What was that?
Oh,
What was your
there's an album called Maybe This Christmas. It has
What was your answer?
an album called Maybe This Christmas. It has songs by Ron Sexsmith and Neil Finn and any number of other people, and I really love that album. It's a terrific album. Oh, and
Okay.
also The Edge of Christmas with like Pat Benatar and Queen and a bunch of other ones. Those are two really favorite Christmas albums of mine.
If you were to have one last meal before you were extracted from the earth by aliens and probed to death, or if you were crucified, what would be your last supper?
Last supper, probably raw chocolate chip cookie dough. I think you can't top that. That's
Has that
go with my gut from that.
Has that got all the food groups in? I mean, can you survive off that? Well,
again, we're back to the how can I just make Sophie's choice this way? It's terrible.
Okay,
can't do it.
If you were to see a band live and they can be dead or alive now, what would the band be?
Oh man. As a 8th grader, it probably would have been ELO or Alan Parsons Project. I'm woefully ill prepared for snappy banter with these questions because I'm taking them way too seriously and I can't think of anything funny.
But you don't have to be funny. It's just an insight into who you are, and it gets people understanding. Okay. And I don't know if you mentioned something earlier about one of these people. I can maybe guess. But if you were stuck in a post-apocalyptic or a present apocalyptic bunker, so you're in a bunker for a month. You can't take family members or anything. What 3 people would you take into the bunker with you for a month?
Oh my goodness.
I mean, I'm guessing Paul. Would you not have taken Paul in with you?
Well, I was more thinking Monica Bellucci, actually.
Is that a beautiful woman? I don't know.
You're saying being a bunker and a monk with Paul? Is that what you said?
You were saying that you would love to have a conversation with him.
But I'm not going to spend a month in a bunker with that guy. Sorry. Knew how. That is just a non-starter. Yeah.
Fair enough. So we've just got Monica Bellucci. Is that it?
Yeah, I'm sure there's a couple others I could picture in that scenario as well, but I'll just leave it at that for now.
Oh dear. Brilliant.
You said we can't take our loved ones, right?
No.
Okay, then the whole thing's off. Yeah.
Have you assumed your loved ones have died in the apocalypse? So
yeah, when you put it that way, there's really no one I can take. Yeah, honestly, yeah.
Okay, well, look, thank you so much for this, David. It's been an absolute pleasure. Is there? What's the best way people can get hold of you? And what do you want to pimp out to the world and tell people that you've got available or coming?
Well, let's see. Yeah, all the things we talked about, especially the forthcoming book is going to be Sex and Violence in the Bible. I've got a podcast, The Power of the Myth of Jesus with David Fitzgerald on Planksip. Stay tuned for the Sex and Violence in the Bible will be the next one. All 3 books of the Time Shards trilogy are out, and I really have a blast. And people who are not me also seem to love them too. So I can't wait to see what you guys think of those. Oh, to find me, probably easiest is on Facebook, or you can always shoot me an email at everybodylovesdave@gmail.com.
Brilliant. Okay, well, that's fantastic. And I'll put a load of links to them in the description when I can find the time to do that tomorrow. But
and I also have a Patreon page. If you like what I do, consider signing up for my Patreon page to help me do that. And I'm going to be much better about putting things you can't find easily anywhere else, like expanded forwards, like reviews of other books on there. So that would be super helpful.
Yeah, and in that same vein of thoughts, can I thank all the people who are supporting this channel, people who did super chats today. Really, really appreciate you. You are like, if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be doing this because I wouldn't be able to justify to my partner why I'm not parenting my boys in the other room. But there you go. But so thank you for all of your kindness and for the great conversation and questions that have been going on at the side. So that's really, really great. David, you're an officer and a gentleman. Thank you so much. Thank you for the forwards to two of my books. And it's great to have finally met you face to face, even though you struggle to hear me. Next time I'll just shout louder.
There you go.
Thanks again.
Consider we're speaking across the world by satellite. The miracle that we take for granted every day. It's been lovely, and I'm delighted to be here.
I think Jesus Christ in outer space has just got a couple of messages through his skull, and it's bounced off. And
good enough for Paul.
Yeah, there you go. Nice. Well, it's a great way to end. Look, you take care. It's been great. All the best, and Merry Christmas to you, mate.
Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas.
Nice.
Good night, all.